1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the High Performance CEO Show, your exclusive insight into the strategies and success habits of the world's top CEOs. I'm your host, Sebastian Schieke, entrepreneur, mentor, and business angel. Prepare to grow your business, enhance your leadership skills, and thrive in today's world. Let's dive in. Hey, welcome to part 2 of my great conversation with Thomas Barnett. We talked about his new book, America's New Map. We talked about how globalization impacted climate change. We talked about global demographic transitions and possible North-South integration, just to name a few. In the following episode, he will share his strategy, how a world could look like, how a world which is able to deal with all these challenges could be shaped in the next years or decades to come. It was such a pleasure talking with Thomas, and I wish you an insightful episode. Let's go a little bit deeper. I think globalization is something everyone is really aware of. When we all live in an area of globalization, we all experience global world, which is now sort of, the perception is that it's changing, the perception that it's getting more decentralized, deglobalized, but you argue in your book that this is just in perception because digital flows are so
underappreciated and under-noticed.
Yeah. But you also argue in your book that the climate change, and there's a breathtaking graph which shows the rise of the climate change in relation to globalization, is a result of this globalized world and the global trades and exchange of goods and increased traveling and whatever is the reason. So, but there are still opinions around that climate change doesn't exist. Yeah, there are still people in high power, and I mean, you experienced this in US with the previous government stepping out of the Paris treatment and denying climate change. You have a lot of really well-researched content in your book about the impact of climate change and the immense pressure we put on our world.
Right.
So you want to share a few of those quite scary facts, to be honest.
Well, I like to describe America as sort of the source code for modern globalization that displaced and replaced the European colonial empire mode of integrating the world. And that mode didn't really increase wealth tremendously between 1500 and, say, 1950. It increased it mostly for the European colonial powers, but for the rest of the world, incomes, life expectancy, standard of living remained relatively flat.
Mm-hmm.
You take the American experience, which is an attempt to create a supranational union, starting with 13 colonies coming together. Now it's 50 states. That integration process, to me, is the forerunner of globalization. Absolutely free trade of goods across these states, free flow of finance, freedom of movement for labor to shift all over. All these things that got written into the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 as kind of revolutionary concepts, which they were for Europe.
Mm-hmm.
We had experienced for decades in the United States, to the extent where if you add up, say, countries with similar GDPs to American states, like Canada has a GDP roughly the same size as New York. India has a GDP roughly the same size as California. Okay, if you added up all those countries and said, that's how I could create an economy the size of the United States, you'd be talking about 2 billion people, not 330 million people.
Okay.
So I'm arguing that tremendous rule set of integration, really hardcore, radical interdependency that we created within the United States,
Mm-hmm.
that was the model we sought to project upon the world.
Okay.
But what happens with that immense activity are things like America's only 5% of the world, but we create 25% of the pollution.
Yeah.
We're only 5% of the world, but we consume 25% of the world's consumption. Okay. So when you take that model and put it out to the wider world, Okay. You're setting in motion wealth creation, poverty reduction, increased utilization of resources. So that if you look at whatever industry it is, moving along throughout time, and then it comes to 1950, it goes like this for the next 5, 6, 7 decades.
Yeah.
So if you take that reality and say, hey, humans cause climate change, it sounds kind of crazy. But humans in globalization, taking the American rule set of intense connectivity and production and growth and consumption, you put that on a global level, everything goes through the roof. It's not just, does temperature go up? Do CO2 emissions go up? We use wood products through the roof. We create plastics through the roof.
Yeah.
We use energy through the roof. Every measure of consumption and resource utilization takes off in 1950 and skyrockets. So much so that scientists now say, with something like 3/4 of the world's landmass having been reformatted by humans, the fact that humans move more rock and sediment every year, 10 times more than Mother Nature does through erosion.
Yeah.
The fact that we put 1 trillion tons, basically the weight of all the structures in the world today, into the atmosphere
as carbon.
CO2.
Yeah.
The fact that we've changed the acid levels of the oceans. I mean, we've changed everything around our planet so much so that scientists say, you have to start calling this the human epic.
Yeah, they're changing the name of, they're changing the name of
geological age.
Geological age, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Which says that humans are now the biggest geological force on the planet, the biggest earth-shaping force. And I would argue that that probably wouldn't have come about without the United States making that effort to spread its rule set after the Second World War and being very successful in doing that. But the price you pay for all that consumption and development and wealth creation and people being lifted out of poverty is that now we have to deal with climate change and the fact that it's going to shift the way we think about the world from east-west. Because if you think about it, going east or west doesn't really change your reality in climate change. You got to go north or south. You got to head towards the poles or up in elevation like all life forms are doing.
Yeah.
And to me, that is the biggest structural change I can imagine to the international system in my lifetime, or really any human's lifetime. And on top of that, you're talking about dealing with a risen global middle class and its desire to maintain what has, for most people, been a very recent escape from basically eternal poverty. We're talking about people who have lived for thousands of years on subsistence, moving into consumption. And when you give that sort of opportunity, that sort of chance, and then you talk about maybe taking it away through circumstances such as climate change, that will create a lot of violence and a lot of instability in the system. And honestly, it's why China's offering of these social control technologies is so attractive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're a young developing state, developing economy, you got a burgeoning middle class, you want to connect to 5G networks, you don't want to be left behind, you want to sell your resources and have access to the new technologies. But you see this creating so much social change. You've seen these kind of countries come apart or shift into kind of ethno-nationalism of the worst sort. The Chinese come in and say, hey, we'll do all this infrastructure. We'll connect you up and we'll give you the technologies to control your public.
Yeah.
We can look at that and say how Orwellian, but for the average leader of an average country facing those sorts of odds or trajectory, that's a hell of an offering. That's a very compelling offering.
It's like a franchise system they're rolling out in the world. A well-working for them, structured system they can just use, plug in, and control their citizen. Yeah.
I argue in the book that China's basically playing Go, and the Americans like to play poker.
Yeah.
So we're in the Ukraine, and every round we move a few more weapons into the pot, and we say, you want to raise it to the next level, Vladimir? You want to risk it? Meanwhile, the Chinese are playing Go, laying down their stones on a go board that is the global map all around the world and creating these little safe zones and then linking them up and creating supply chains and then kind of linking them up even further and creating entire continents that are bought into Belt and Road, that are bought in to Huawei's vision of a safe city offering, the technologies of social control that they're peddling with great effect across many parts of the world.
Which is,
on that basis, it's like we're playing two different games. We think we're winning the pot every so often on these geopolitical military crises. Meanwhile, China's just building around the world.
And they have such a long-term strategy. Yeah. This is what I'm missing in politics. Yeah. In European politics and American politics. I mean, you have leaders who are in charge for 4 years. You know, they have their strategy, but I'm missing the long-term view. You know, long-term view on the world, and they have it. I mean, not for our advantage, but they have a long-term view, a long-term mission, and as you said, they're laying these stones out there.
And they know demographically that their time of greatest opportunity doesn't last forever.
No,
they're already starting to depopulate. They need to lock in and lock down and quote unquote conquer or integrate parts of the global economy to their advantage on their best terms as early and as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Europe and the United States, I would argue, we're gazing into our belly buttons, asking questions like, what does it mean to be German in a society where all sorts of non-Germans are coming? Or what does it mean to be American, which is code word for white? In America, if, the white population becomes majority minority in about 20 years. And we're facing these kinds of existential crises when we really need to start thinking in terms of evolution and adaptation. Scientists estimate that what climate change is doing to species around the world is asking them, in effect, to evolve about 10,000 times faster than they normally do. And that's why we're witnessing this huge mass extinction going on right now. The sixth greatest great extinction in human history, probably the second biggest in volume, only trailing the one where the giant meteor came and created the Gulf of Mexico and wiped off all the dinosaurs. I mean, and it's totally man-made, okay? So if you're experiencing that kind of evolutionary pressure throughout nature, the same thing has to be true for political systems. And the reality of Darwin's logic is not that the strongest survive. It's the species that are most adaptable to change, that can evolve most quickly. And so I'm trying to argue in this book, despite our tendency to get caught in these kind of Cold War mechanics and the natural tendency of our mature and increasingly gerontocracy class of leaders, they grew up in the Cold War. That's what they know. They're very comfortable declaring Cold Wars. If you search the U.S. media landscape on a daily basis, I guarantee you can find about 50 Cold Wars declared in op-eds and articles on a daily basis. I mean, we are constantly declaring these things. And it's really like we talked about earlier, it's an escape into the past. Where you could tell who was who without a playing card, as some people say, and where you knew who was good and who was bad, and it was a simpler time, and it's what I grew up in. And as I lose my sense of that youthful vision that I had 50 years ago, the more paranoid and the more venal I become in my politics as I age. And this is sort of the plight of the boomer generation in the United States, and to a certain extent, Gen X. But if you look at millennials, Gen Zs, they grew up as natives in a digital world. They grew up as natives in a world that is white majority minority already. My example is my 23-year-old son, born in the year 2000. That's the year whites became majority minority among babies.
Okay.
And then he's 10 years old, and he's part of a 10-year group where whites are majority minority. And then he's 20 years old and he's part of a 20-year-old cohort where whites are majority minority. And the older he goes, his reality already there follows him. So that when you talk to my 23-year-old son, he has no doubt about all these things. He has no confusion. He doesn't have to be woke or non-woke.
Yeah.
He already lives in that world. He's grown up with it his entire time. And yes, he can be really confusing to older people. But I mean, that's the reality. And those are the generations that are going to run the United States. And on that basis, help run the world mid-century. And that's the people I'm speaking to in this book. I don't intend or hope to change a lot of boomers on this subject.
Well, you won't know.
Or Gen X's, or their equivalents across the world. I'm really talking to people who are going to have to live in this world and deal with it.
I would argue I'm a Gen X, so I find this book fascinating and taking so much.
But you find it shocking, too.
I find it shocking to read this on paper, yes.
Yeah. And, my kids, when they read it, or younger people I work with at Throughline, they don't find it shocking. They're glad it's out there.
Yeah.
But to them, it seems conventional. It seems logical. It doesn't seem like radical to them.
Yeah.
And that's what the book's trying to tap into. It should be something that people can recognize and say, I've been thinking along these lines for a long time too.
Yeah.
I was just waiting for somebody to express it. That's what you want to activate with a book like this is a sense that this is logical. It's not just a great idea in a book. It's tapping into larger things that make sense to a lot of people who have been thinking very similar things, and we're just waiting for the articulation to come along.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't find shocking your strategy. I find shocking really the change we put on the planet. Yeah. Reading this one statement that we changed 97% of the world with climate environment. Yeah. Those are shocking numbers, I think. You can't read them often enough because, media often, depends who they want to serve, they give you this information or that information.
Historically, our religions, our political ideologies, capitalism and Marxism were all based on this notion of taming nature and bending it to our will and making it, what we wanted of it and to remake the world in our image. That's the old Karl Marx concept of, actualization as humans kind of make the world in their image.
Yeah.
Okay. We've been doing that across all ideologies, all religions for quite some time. And now we have to wake up to the reality that, we've done it to such a profound extent that it's starting to impact how we live. I've been writing a lot of posts recently tracking news stories about, uninsurable areas in the United States. Or where Phoenix right now has basically come to the conclusion that it can't grow anymore. A major metropolitan area, they look ahead and they say, we just can't sustain it here. Our mini civilization, this giant urban accumulation is going to collapse under its own weight unless we start to control population growth, development, and start to radically rethink how we use resources, most notably water. And so we're starting to see things now that are impacting our ability to build a house, much less buy a house, much less finance it for 30 years, much less get somebody willing to pay insurance on it because I live in a dangerous part of the world based on climate change. So these things are starting to really appear in profound ways. The boomers may not wake up to it. They're still, migrating towards Florida and Arizona and New Mexico and Texas like there's no tomorrow. But if you're a young person trying to buy your first house or contemplating, what it would be to retire somewhere realistically, people are pointing to the Dakotas and Wisconsin and Michigan and upstate New York as being the places where you're going to want to deal with climate change 20, 30, 40 years from now. Whereas New Mexico, Florida, these places, Arizona, they're going to be under some extraordinary stress that we're starting to see now, where it's really impacting every aspect of urban development.
I spent the last 6 months in New Zealand, and the amount of flooding happened the last 6 months I've never seen before. I mean, they're complete areas wiped out by water. There are areas in towns where you can't insure your house anymore, because the rising rivers are... and this is not happening once every 10 years. Yeah, it's happening twice a year.
Once every 2 or 3 years.
Yes, or even faster. And these are really very visible signs. We had a big drama in Germany last year, where flooding wiped out half of the village, leaving I don't know, 180 people dead. Yeah, which was devastating. So,
we've always viewed wealth largely in terms of land.
Mm-hmm.
And one way to think about climate change is that it's basically taking livable space, good land you want to live on, land you want to grow food on, land you can build cities on, because the climate niche feels good.
Yeah.
Feels about right. Okay. That historically has been about the 27th parallel north, where you get like 2/3 of humanity clustered along that line. It's where a lot of the great cities of the world and great civilizations of the world have developed over time. Well, that livable niche is heading north in what they describe as a climate velocity. A climate that used to be in one place is now moving every year northward. So that we're looking at, in effect, across that Middle Earth, roughly 2 Australias worth of land kind of becoming unusable or unlivable or really hard to live on.
Yes.
And instead, you're seeing 2 Australias worth appear kind of magically in the north, in Canada, in the Arctic regions across Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's going to be land where people can live.
If they want to live.
It's going to be land where you're going to grow food.
Yeah.
And that is arguably the biggest real estate transaction in human history, going to happen in about 30, 40 years. Nobody's going to make any money on it, because no money is going to be exchanged, across borders. Yeah. And yet the North is going to benefit tremendously, and the South is going to pay a very heavy price in terms of food insecurity, in terms of water insecurity, in terms of migratory pressures from rural to urban, and from one country to the next country over, and ultimately from those Middle Earth countries towards the global North. So tremendous changes happening, very practically captured now. When State Farm tells California that it won't offer home insurance anymore in the state of California, that's a very practical thing that's going to impact your mortgage payment on a monthly basis. And when that sort of evidence starts to appear in people's mailboxes, it gets a lot harder to deny the notion that climate change is powerful and impactful.
But then your argument with the superpower brand war comes in, because countries need to attract people. I mean, who wants to live in Russia how it looks at the moment? I mean, everyone will probably migrate to Western Europe,
or China sends large numbers of migrants. Maybe India sends large numbers of migrants. Maybe Central Asia sends large numbers of migrants. Maybe Russia becomes a state that's captured from a variety of angles, and maybe isn't an empire 20, 30 years from now, because it can't survive the process.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have the right attractiveness or national brand to bring people in and unify them under a concept.
Yeah.
I mean, America does, I would argue.
Canada. Yeah.
I would argue America and Canada are the perfect marriage going forward for both countries, because we have what they lack in terms of resources, but they have what we lack in terms of natural resources. We have the finance and we have the bodies to make it happen, but they have the natural resources and the land and everything else. You put those two countries together, that's a powerful package. You put China and Russia together. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that we're looking at now, China and Russia coming together, is reflective of an underlying economic rationale that's fueled to a certain extent by climate change. China's trying to live with 1/6 of the world's population on about 1/20th of the world's water.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And there's Russia to the north with all this land opening up and all the capacity. And a lot of China's southern farmlands are going to come under extraordinary stress from climate change. I think a lot of these emerging alliances that you're going to see are going to be more north-south in nature. They're going to reflect people's sense of resource vulnerabilities going forward, having to do with climate change. I mean, if I'm the Middle East, I'm making deals with northern powers as much as possible because I'm facing a very unsustainable future, especially as, the response to climate change includes moving off fossil fuels towards renewables. I got to remake myself pretty dramatically to have people interested by part of the world and be willing to protect it alongside my own efforts. And so that superpower brand argument says, in effect, the world is going through this 4 to 5 decade period of tumult, reshaping, rise of a global middle class, demographic collapse in the north, climate change impacting all over, but tremendously across those lower latitudes. That's a lot of structural change. And there's a lot of risk in concentrations there that a lot of individual countries won't be able to handle. This is not a future where Honduras wants to go alone. This is not a future with, where Egypt wants to go alone or anybody really wants to go alone, which makes the UK's exit from the EU, even more baffling.
Exactly. I just want to say, you say, okay, in the end, we have to unite somehow as
we have to integrate.
Yeah. But from my perspective and perspective of many people, countries sort of separate each other from each other at the moment, with all these challenges, UK exiting the European Union and all these conflicts in the world. This is more like a separated world. So how do we bring this together,
Those things tend to arrive similarly under pressures. Whenever the economy's going well, integration impulses tend to go down. Why? Everybody's making money. It takes pain before the logic of integration becomes an acceptable pathway to take the risk, to make the effort. But when you're in that economic pain, there's a natural instinct to go nationalistic and to say, take care of my own and to hell with everybody else. So you have those two things fighting at the same time, and they kind of naturally come together. If you're integrating fast, you're going to have friction from that integration. You have the gay LGBTQ becoming more acceptable. That's not going to happen without a rise in homophobia.
Yeah.
Okay. You're not going to have the diversification of the racial makeup of a country without racism happening at the same time. That force will create a commensurate friction. Okay. So with great force comes tremendous friction. And we have a tendency, in the way we look at the world, to see the bad and focus on the bad and not pay attention to the force that's creating all that friction. And I would argue that what climate change is doing in terms of creating that north-south integrating force, the fact that we're feeling a lot of friction right now, migrants coming across the Med into Europe, migrants coming across the Rio Grande into the United States, that doesn't tell us that this future isn't going to happen. It doesn't tell us that this future isn't inevitable or something that we have to accomplish. It's just giving us a sense now that the pain is preceding the solution.
Yeah.
So the fact that we are freaking out over migrants in the United States and Europe is doing the same, that doesn't tell me that that's not the future. That tells me that we're just beginning to realize what the problem set is.
Yeah.
And we hate it because it's change.
Yeah.
Because it's challenging. Because that's going to be a very different Germany or France or Texas or California. Some states can handle that. Some cannot. And you're going to see all sorts of struggles within countries to do better through integration and certain amount of separation and carving out of identities at the same time. So to release those pressures while you're kind of moving ahead against them. But, America was a very imperfect place the first 170 years. through 1965 or roughly. And yet we added states throughout that process. Whatever the problem was, everybody roughly agreed more states were better. And we'd have better problems the bigger we grew. And I would argue the EU has had all sorts of zigs and zags for the last 60 years. And yet you've always had this underlying logic that says, hey, we'll have better problems if we continue to grow. The more we bring in, the more we integrate, the more we pool our sovereignty, the better our problem sets will be. Won't get rid of our problems necessarily, but we'll have better problems.
Quality problems. Yes, exactly. Right. And you have a better position in the world. Yeah.
And we're in a better bulked up status, which allows us to compete. Because if you're just Hungary trying to compete on global markets, you're basically screwed.
Yeah.
But if you're the EU with 500 million consumers, thereabouts, then you have to be respected to a certain extent because of all that purchasing power. And I look at the United States, that was, purchasing power-wise, by far the biggest force in the world in 2000. You go to 2050, and we'll be dwarfed by the combination of India and China. And Americans don't understand what that means because we've been the center of global demand, outsized, based on our population for about 50, 60 years. And within that, the boomer generation was the preeminent driver of taste and preferences and consumption in the United States. So that we're talking about an America that's used to seeing the world cater to its whims, consumer-wise. And in 30 years, we're going to live in a world that caters to Chinese and Indian consumers.
They are the primary.
And that will be, that will be as confusing for people as anything else. As a Chinese family moving into your all-white neighborhood or an Indian family moving into your all-white town, that larger reality of having the commercial world changed is very disorienting. A lot of comics in America like to joke about how you can't watch television today without seeing an interracial couple in a commercial. It seems like every couple, every family in a commercial, it's two different races and blended kids.
Okay.
And they say, why is it going to be like that? Why do they make it so woke? Why are they shoving this down our throat? And if you look at the census, the fastest growing group in America is mixed race. So that's business saying, hey, do I want to make mixed race people happy with my product?
Of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
They're a growing share of the market.
Yeah.
I don't want them to feel alienated. I don't want them to feel like they can't see themselves in commercials. I'm going to give it to them because I want to make money. I want to grow. I want to have a strong market share, which frankly is what ESG is all about. It's long-range thinking on the environment, social issues, and governance to make sure you got the biggest market out there that you could access and succeed in building brand loyalty on. And if politicians are telling you to ignore that because, that's woke or that's ideological or something like that, to me, that's just burying your head with regard to these larger changes and not accepting the fact that, hey, if you want to play on that level and you're the United States, China will be about 50 trillion mid-century. India will be about 35 trillion mid-century. We'll be 30 trillion in the United States. But if the United States were to integrate the Western Hemisphere into a larger union, we'd be more like 45 trillion because we'd be 1 billion people in terms of a market. We'd have tremendous capacity, tremendous economic and resource wealth, tremendous demand power within the system, and our tastes and preferences would be far more catered to in a global economy than if we said, hey, America or death, white America or nothing. I mean, that's going to be a really small country mid-century. It's probably going to look like Japan.
Your book is fascinating, Thomas. When will it be released? When it's on the market?
On the 26th of September. You can buy the hard. You can buy the hard copy version. You can buy the ebook version, and you can buy the audiobook version, which hasn't been made yet. Actually, we sold it to Brilliance Audio, the Amazon subsidiary. And I'm going to go tape the book sometime in the next few weeks, which I'm very excited to do because I've never narrated them.
Yeah.
So it's on the bucket list, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to cross it off. And, it was written to be more speech-like, more oral delivery.
Yes.
And these wonderful illustrations by these tremendous artists at Throughline. We got all these data visualizations. I wrote other books in the past that were 400 pages long that had 150,000 words in them.
Yes.
Okay. This book is 400 pages long and it has 67,000 words in it. So, like about 40% the usual volume of words, but that's because we got all these visual imagery.
It's easy to digest.
People retain visual information so much stronger, and they retain arguments so much better if it's paired with visual representations.
Yeah.
Plus, it was just, I'm a big fan of political cartoons throughout history. And I grew up on this one illustrated history of the United States that was put out by the American Heritage Foundation. And they had all these fantastic political cartoons going back to the Revolutionary period. And to me, that's how I kind of learned, it was almost like a Mad Magazine history of the United States. And those kinds of visual imagery have stuck with me so tremendously that the opportunity to do something like this with a book has been just a dream come true. And it was fabulous to be able to tell an illustrator, hey, I'm looking for something that would, sort of feel like a Dr. Seuss visual or like a classic political cartoon from the 50s or something like that. If you could kind of maybe this image, maybe something like that, and then to see it come together so brilliantly with so much creative input from these illustrators, most specifically a guy named Jim Nuttall, who's a graphic artist of note at Throughline, and his daughter, Sarah. And it was interesting because about a third of the ideas for the illustrations came from me, and Jim just executed it. Another third, I couldn't come up with an idea, and Jim would come up with something. He's about the same age as me, early 60s. And we'd say, oh my God, fantastic. I love that cartoon. It recalls something from my youth or something like that.
Yeah.
And then another third of the time, these two guys in their late 50s, early 60s didn't have a clue how to reach out to the subsequent generations with an image that would grab them. And his daughter, also an artist, Sarah Nuttall, she would come up with this great idea. And we'd say, oh my God, I hadn't even considered such a concept. So it was this tremendous creative process, and hopefully is something that people can dive into, not unlike, as one of the reviewers of the book put it, she said it's like a graphic novel for futurists. And I could really see this being a graphic novel at some the future, exploring some of the ideas.
It is, I read it over a long weekend. It's amazingly well.
It's designed to be read over a long weekend, or really we've had people fly back from Korea to California and read it on the flight.
Yeah.
And if your argument's sharp enough, you should be able to get it across.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's always, people unfortunately don't read that much anymore. Yeah. So if you give them a book with 1,000 pages, they will probably not start. Yeah. But if you give them a book with illustration, which they can read on a long plane flight or over the weekend, this is how you create change. And especially for the generation where it's supposed to be, it's a fantastic tool.
Right. And that's like a microcosm of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
You can stay stuck in your ways and say, hey, this is what I grew up with. This is how you write a book. Yeah. I'm not changing. You got to change.
We talk about change, so we have to be role models for change.
So, if the market changes, then you got to change your delivery to get it across.
Is there anything else important you would like to share? We touched so many topics. The book is full with a lot of interesting insights and information. Is there anything you say, I would like to really bring this across before we wrap up the conversation, Thomas?
Well, I guess I would say, when we wrote the book, and I use the term we because I got such tremendous support from Throughline, the company, who really came to me and said, we really want to try this sort of book and to build this sort of content as a vehicle to change people's minds and to guide corporate thinking going forward. Because in a lot of these instances, the corporate world is way ahead of the public sector on this. The public sector is dealing with all this recalcitrance from the population, from citizens, and from, kind of left-wing opposition to globalization and right-wing opposition now to globalization and a certain amount of diversity, equity, inclusiveness, that kind of stuff, DEI, ESG, all these things become, culture war targets. I decided that we weren't going to kind of lay out the actual pathway to this kind of integration. We were going to focus on the argument of being able to detach from past ways of looking at the world and embracing these new ways of looking at the world without kind of laying out the roadmap from here to there. I didn't want to try to boil the ocean, figure everything out, give you a 30-step manifesto at the end, even though I do give you a manifesto for America's First as a strategy. I didn't want to say, this is how it has to be done. Costa Rica is the 52nd state. Alberta comes down and becomes the 53rd from Canada or anything like
UK.
that. The UK. Because I'd like to be able to go there without a visa or without my passport. Because I got relatives and I originate in Europe, in Germany, and in the British Isles. So natural affinity. But I didn't want to get caught up in that sort of concrete steps from here to there. One, because I thought this journey is going to be very complex, and the idea that I can figure that out, that's going to get me a 150,000 word book that nobody's going to read.
Yep.
And if they did, they're going to take apart every little idea of actualization, in part because there's no way one person's figuring that out in a book. It's just not happening.
Yep.
What you're trying to create here is a dialogue and get people to think along these lines. So, for example, one of the things I've been thinking about recently and I'm starting to explore is this notion of a composable enterprise, which is sort of the evolutionary adaptation that the business world, it's a term invented by Gartner, to describe thinking about your enterprise as a series of digital transactions in many ways. And so you want a plug and play mentality to your architecture and your IT design because you're always going to be adapting. And whatever portal works for one customer or one flow, one transaction, one sort of service offering may not work for the next one. So you should be able to have all sorts of composability, modularity, a certain amount of autonomy within the various groups that do this, a certain sort of authority above them, and then a very discovery-driven process of adaptation. And to me, it's like Darwin on steroids for business. It's saying if you want to play and play hard and do well, you got to be able to rapidly evolve according to whatever it takes to get this digital offering or this product offering, this supply chain to happen in the way you need to make it happen. And this notion of having kind of a locked in structure to your organization and your business is just death. It's the opposite of evolution. I'd like to take some of those ideas, the composable enterprise, and apply it to sort of the composable American Union and say there are attributes of state membership, say transactions that happen, good flows, various interactions that are locked in and made as smooth and as frictionless as possible. If you broke down that sense of membership in the American Union into a variety of components and then started offering those components on an as desired basis to a variety of potential applicants, there may be all sorts of categories of memberships in a larger American Union that could accommodate, sort of like how some are in the Schengen zone in the EU and some are not. Some have the Euro, some do not. They have various levels and overlapping kind of Venn diagram of memberships and belonging and various offerings to North Africa and the Middle East that are different from actually being in the EU and yet offer access to the EU on a preferential basis. I think we should have a rethinking of the American Union a rethinking of what it means to be a member state.
Yeah.
Start commoditizing or modularizing those aspects and offering them as a way to attract adherence to our larger network, our larger brand, our larger offering. Because if we don't, then in our absence, you're going to see the Chinese version come in and grab it, or you're going to see the Russian version,
little
aid-centric,
plugs.
right? With their ability to track everything that you do online and all that kind of stuff. Either we offer a better sense of belonging moving forward, or we're going to lose out and find ourselves on our heels with regard to an integration that needs to happen, say, north and south in the Western Hemisphere to deal with climate change and everything else. If the Chinese already got there before we did, we're going to regret that. In the same way that I think Europe would regret, losing the Med to outside influences, because ultimately that's where you're going to see the logic of the EU succession process, which again is not about instant gratification or instant gain. It's about eliminating problems deep into the future.
Yeah.
Would it be better to have them on the inside or the outside 30 years from now? And your logic tends to be better to have them on the inside. I'll do better. He'll do better. We'll both do better. And we'll both, collectively become more powerful on that basis. I think that's the model. And I would love to have conversations, along those kinds of exploratory lines with all sorts of players from all sorts of fields, all sorts of industries. But we left that open. We didn't try to provide a total cookbook that would elucidate every pathway and every possibility, because, again, it would have been presumptuous. It would have curtailed dialogue that we think needs to happen. And it would deprive us of that discovery process, which is one of the core concepts of the Composable Enterprise, that you're discovery oriented, that you're constantly kind of moving into new territory and figuring out how to integrate it, how to access it, and improve it and make it part of your long-term capabilities and market. And I think if you're not aggressive like that as a nation state, then you're either adding stars, as I say in the book, or you're losing
stars. Yeah. Let's add stars both in Europe and in the US.
Yeah. I mean, you guys aren't changing. You don't change your flag like we do. Historically, we have to add the actual star. And if you look at the cover of the book, there's a bit of an Easter egg there. It looks like a normal map, but if you actually count up the stars, it's about 140.
Okay.
And, we want to plant that logic, If Europe can expand like that and it's a great thing, and everybody admires it, then the United States should be able to do it too. Whatever our pasts were in terms of colonialization or conquest of the American West or these kinds of things, look into the future. There are good reasons to take advantage of that skill set.
Yeah.
And to make it widely available. Because again, this future is not about I'm better off on my own. This is a future where we're better off going together.
Yeah. Thomas, I'm looking so much forward to holding your book in my hand, and I already know a couple of people I will give this as a present to. So thank you so much for your time today. I mean, this is full of wisdom, interesting points, and I'm sure my listeners will take a lot of out of this conversation. I wish you all the best, creating the impact you want to create with this book, and I'm looking forward to follow your work in the future. Thanks a lot, Thomas, being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for tuning into the High Performance CEO Show. I'm your host, Sebastian Schieke, and it's been a pleasure serving you. Please subscribe to our show on your favorite platform and leave us a review. Your support helps us reach more listeners and create a bigger impact. Check out our website, sebastianschieke.com, for additional resources. Until next time, be bold, be exceptional, be outstanding, be a leader.